Hello again, you sick, twisted weather freaks, and welcome to another fun filled, action packed, and intellectually stimulating edition of This Week in Weather. I'm your host and meteorologist, DT, from weatherrisk.com, the colonel of confusion, the captain of catastrophe, the commander of chaos. It's Monday, actually 1 a.m. on the 16th. Just finished watching the last episode of Sherlock. And it's time to get around to doing This Week in Weather, and a lot to talk about here, so this should be a really good episode. Our topics first will include Welcome to the Pacific Jet from Hell. That's what we're looking at for the next 7 days, as the western U.S. is going to get battered with tremendous snowstorms, and for the mountains, a huge rains on the coast. Just a tremendous weather pattern coming up for those guys. Meanwhile, the eastern half of the CONUS, the continental U.S., continues to be torchy McTorson, very warm pattern there. And then, of course, the indications of a pattern change develop January 22nd to the 25th, with a major low which develops over the lower plains into the Midwest. And a severe weather outbreak is likely for much of the lower plains, the Delta, and a good portion of the Midwest, and maybe even the southeastern states. And then the Midwest low will jump to the New England coast with a possible New England snowstorm for January 25th. And then what happens? Well, we'll see what February looks like, but February has a lot of promise. So let's get right to it here. Temperatures the last 5 days here. You can see how warm it has been over much of the country except for the Pacific Northwest and the Northern Rockies. And actually, I'm sure this trend will continue here over the next few days. Here's the latest surface map. We can see our big system here in this deep south where we had actually severe weather during the Cowboys Packers football game. They had some tornadoes down in this area as well. You can see the squall line here. Here's the low pressure area. One area of high is over the east coast, the other one's in the Idaho, and this big system here hammering the middle portion of the lower plains. And you see the latest radar, you can see that as well. The big ice storm over Kansas and into southern Iowa, eastern Nebraska, and then snow in the high country of New Mexico and southwestern Nebraska. That's really the only weather to talk about right now in terms of sensible conditions. Now let's take a look at the actual atmospheric pattern as of Sunday morning here, or Sunday at midday, January 15th. Now, I want to point out here, this here is our polar vortex. You can see this very nicely. Notice how it is shaped like a football. And when the polar vortex is shaped like a football in a west-east direction, that generally allows the Pacific jet to come underneath it and make it a mild pattern. And that's essentially what we're looking at here. Now, this is our southern system right here, which is causing the big storm in Texas. But you can see the big ridge of high pressure over the eastern United States and the Midwest as well with the warm temperatures. And all the cold air is locked up in this polar vortex. So that's the current pattern as it stands right now. As we take a look at a bit more detail, as of Sunday morning, again, you can see our big system over northern Mexico moving into Texas, the huge ridge covering all the Midwest and the East Coast, and the vortex, like I said, the polar vortex is shaped like a football. And when it's shaped west to east, that's where the cold air is. So that's one of the reasons why the Pacific jet is coming blasting in. There's nothing to stop it. There's no blocking over Greenland, and the Arctic Oscillation is positive. It's just there's nothing to stop it, and the Pacific jet is just dominating the pattern. Now, this is as of 84 hours, taking us a Wednesday. We can begin to see the changes take place in the overall pattern. First, the polar vortex shifts and centers over Alaska, becomes one big center here in Alaska, and that establishes a very deep trough here on the west coast. So this piece of energy begins to come out like so, and we still have the huge ridge here. So what's happening is the jet stream is doing this and it's going over the ridge. You see that? Doing this and going over the ridge that way. But of course, the Pacific jet is still bringing more systems in each time. So, and we'll see as we go through the next slide here. Now, this one is 108 hours, which takes us to Thursday evening. Now, the ridge is still very, as you can see, very powerful right here. But look at all these systems that are coming into the Pacific jet stream. Here's our trough. There's the vortex right here. One system here, another system here. The other system is here. Boom, boom, boom. Big. Now, this system right here, system number 2, this is going to slam California and the Great Basin with a huge amount of precipitation over the next several days. But these are powerful systems indeed. And of course, now this is 132 hours for Friday evening. And now what's happening is, notice what's going on with the ridge here. The ridge, which originally started over here, remember we were over here a couple of days ago? Now look where it is. It's up here. See that? See how it's moving northward? And one of the reasons it's moving northward is because the Pacific Jet is digging down in this direction. So it's forcing the entire ridge to move northward in this direction because all of this is coming in. So we have one piece of energy here, as you can see. Let me call my marker again so you can see it. One system is here, another system is here, and another system is here. Three of them in a row, like coming off an aircraft carrier. I mean, the West Coast, the Rockies, the Great Basin, they're just going to get hammered over the next several days with these tremendous systems. Just boom, 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 like they're coming off an aircraft carrier, one after another after another. But the ridge over the eastern United States is still very strong. But like we said, it's beginning to move to the north into central and eastern Canada. And that's important because that's how the pattern changes begins to take place. Now, this is our temperature anomalies at the surface for the next 5 days. Look how warm it is, especially for the east from the plains, but especially east of the Mississippi River, and again over south central Canada for that matter, relative to normal for the middle of January. Very impressive temperatures here. So this is a torch. Now, as we go towards next weekend, Saturday, January 25th, we see our strong ridging is now pushed up into this area. You remember earlier, it was down in here. So now it has moved definitely up to the north in this direction. And meanwhile, the Pacific Jet is still howling in this way, coming underneath it, going underneath the block. No longer going in this way, now going underneath it here. So we have one system here, the next system is here, and there's our polar vortex still in Alaska. But now, because the blocking has moved to the north, because the blocking which was over the ridge, which was over here, is now up here, all this energy has to go underneath it, and that begins the pattern change. Now, this is a rainfall for the next 7 days. As you can see, a lot of rain here for the deep south and for the dry areas. They need that rain, actually. And look at the precipitation going from Los Angeles all the way up to British Columbia. Very impressive. Now, by 180 hours out, we begin to see the system that's going to affect the Midwest here. The next piece of energy, and let me call this back for 1 second so we can call this up in 1 second. You can see where this was. This is the system here. This is the one that's going to affect the Midwest, the one right here. See that? Okay, so I want to point that one out to you. All right, let's go back forward again a little. Now, this is the Midwest system. It's now over Louisiana, and look at this enormous ridge right here. Wow, blocking it. So the Midwest system is going to want to go in this direction, in this way, but of course it can't. It's going to be deflected to that, like that. So it's want to go to Chicago, Michigan, but it won't be able to. It'll die, and a new low will reform here later on. And of course, there's another system right over in this direction coming in to the West Coast, another monster bomb coming in for next weekend for those guys. Now, this is what it looks like at the surface. Actually, that came out of sequence. This is what it looks like at the surface. Now, this is for the morning of the 24th. Look at that huge low between Chicago and Detroit. And you can see the triple point here forming right here in this direction right here. You can see it taking over. And then as I go back to one slide, there it is at the morning of the 25th. It's off the New England coast. It's bombing New England with probably a significant snowstorm. So that's what I think is going to happen with it. Now, the ensembles are showing the same sort of thing. There's a system on the morning of the 23rd with one low, as you can see here, but a triple point low here. And again, look at the warm air coming up this way. So initially for the East Coast, this is rain for everybody. This is all warm air coming up this way. This is rain for everybody. You can see that when you look at the temperature profiles. Here's the European ensembles. The snow line is west of Chicago, folks. It's west of Wisconsin. This is all rain for everybody east of the Mississippi River at the start of the event. Not at the end, but at the start of the event. So this is rain for Virginia, North Carolina, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, and most of New England. Later on, it changes, and we'll see how it changes in a second. Now, this is the ensemble at 228 hours out. You can see the one low is dying over Michigan. The new low is forming over New Jersey, becoming the big storm here. And this is the ensemble at 240 hours. We now have a huge block which is developed here over eastern Canada, which is now forcing the NAO to go. The NAO is now being forced to go negative in that condition. And the polar vortex, which was here over Alaska, that's now broken down completely. So that's a good news. And there's our next system coming out of the southwest. Now, what we don't have at this point is no flow of cold air. Let me clear this out again so you can see what I'm talking about. Let's look at the pattern here. This flow is going like this, and this flow is doing this. We need the cold air to come in that way. We're not seeing that yet, but there's a start. It's to a transition. The 6 to 10 day, look how warm it is. Wow, that's impressive. I mean, Holy mackerel, that's warm air. And the 8 to 14 day, there's our system, which again, which covers the 24th, the 25th, the 26th for the Midwest and the East Coast and New England. And this, you can see the total precipitation for the East Coast. And again, the West Coast getting battered with more big storms there as well. Now, if we look at the CFS week 3 and week 4, we can see some important features here. Now we can see that CFS is trying to develop a ridge and a pretty significant run over the northwest Canada, which drops the cold air into the United States. But we still had, if this, and on this map here, we still have a let me call it my marker here. Still have a negative NAO right here. You can see it. The NAO is right here. You see we have negative height anomalies here. So we still have a nice ridge on the west coast, a positive PNA, but we don't have a lot of blocking yet. But week 4 we do. We begin to see some strong blocking over Greenland, the Arctic Oscillation, a deep trough over the eastern United States. So that's by the early mid-February. We're definitely in a pattern. Look at the change in the CFS over the last 9 days. Now this is what the CFS model, this is all for February, okay? All of this is for February, the forecast. Now, we're looking at trends. This is January 7th. Look how warm it is. Now this is January 15th. Look how cold it is. See the change? That's pretty significant over 9 days. So it's definitely trending colder. That's a good sign. Now let's take a look at how the pattern, why the pattern is changing. Now this is a same sort of map we showed earlier. This is a hemispheric shot. And you can see that the polar vortex is, again, is in this whole area. It's running in a west to east orientation, or west northwest, east southeast. You see it right in here, just shaped like a football, and that's where all the cold air is. Okay. Now what happens is that the top of the atmosphere, where the changes was going to occur, it has to do with what's known as sudden stratospheric warming, which is a fancy weather term meaning warming at the top levels of the atmosphere. Now this is for 72 hours, this is 120 hours out, and we can still see where all the cold air is. Now this is 500 millibars, but the point here is that look at the cold air. That's what this cold air does. When you see a trough, when you see these low numbers like 480, okay, and 500 decameters, that represents cold air. Okay, the cold air which sinks to the ground. So that's why this is so low. That's why these numbers are low. When you see red numbers like this and you see high numbers, that represents a bubble of warm air going up in the atmosphere. So this is warm air relative to normal, and this is cold air relative to normal. And that's why the jet stream drops the way it does and rises other locations. So that's what all this, now let me show you how this changes things. Now this is the 10 millibar level, the very, very, very top of the atmosphere. And this is as of January 15th. Now there's the polar vortex. We can clearly see it at the top of the atmosphere centered over the Arctic region. And it's a huge pool of cold air, just like this. And this is a large pool of warm air. And then because the cold air is so strong over the northwest Canada and the Arctic region into central Siberia, that's where the vortex is located. Right there. See it? See it? Okay. Let's go on. Now it begins to change here. Now 132 hours out. This is January 21st. Again, look at the change here. See how it's shifting and moving over towards the Arctic Circle? And if we go further down the road, you can see the warm air now, the cold air is now way over here, over Scandinavia in this whole area, and the warm air, this was cold only several 10 days ago, is now warming up and it's moving towards Canada. And this means you're going to get ridging and blocking forming over Canada, which sets up cold patterns and stormy patterns for February. That's why that's important. And finally, by 384 hours out, January 31st, you can see that the red is now centered, moving from Eurasia into the North Pole and the Arctic region, which represents the potential for blocking patterns and all sorts of conditions favorable for snowstorm patterns in the Midwest on the East Coast. And this is what it actually looks like at 300 hours out. Now the European, we begin to see a flow. Look, now we're seeing the ridge, see that? We're beginning to see some cold air come back at the United States. There's some sort of disturbance here on the 28th of January. Okay, we still have a NAO, which is a positive here. Okay, but we are getting a West Coast ridge, a PNA. That's nice. We're seeing that. And the Arctic Oscillation is down neutral. Some sort of system right here. We'll see if that actually becomes something or not. And then as you go to the 29th, you can clearly see a very strong piece of energy over Virginia, North Carolina. This might be a winter storm for the East Coast on the 29th of January. It might not be. We don't know that yet. And then finally, this is the hemispheric shot 300 hours out. You can see the pattern is changing rapidly. Notice the intense polar vortex, which we saw earlier. You remember how it was all intense in here? Totally different, much more diffuse here. Much more general weakness in the heights here in this whole area. And finally, this is the GFS, which is to go down at 384 hours out. You can clearly see the flow of the GFS. Look at the lines here coming out of the Arctic region, straight from Russian Siberia. Arctic connection, cross-polar flow. Now, the Arctic oscillation is still here, so the GFS is still saying a positive Arctic oscillation, and it's still saying a positive NAO according to the GFS model. I don't know if that's going to happen, but that's where it's showing. So we're not yet at the ideal February pattern. Not yet. We're getting there. Now, let's take a look at the MJO. The MJO as of January 14th, you can see it very high, so you can highlight it right here. There it is on the 14th. It's right in the neutral circle. See that? Now, this is phase 7, this is phase 8, and this is phase 1 and phase 2. Okay, here are what the models are doing with the system. The European model takes it out of the neutral zone, moves into phase 8 and phase 1 and then phase 2, and then rotates it. Look what it does here. It brings it back, brings it back into this area by January 29th. So it swings out 8 and 1 and 2, and then goes back in the neutral circle again. The European monthly model does the same thing, but notice it goes back out again. It brings it out here, phase 8, 1, 2, then back in the neutral circle, then back to 7 or 8 again in mid-February. Now that's important, February in phase 8, if that actually happens, and I'll show you why in a second. And then finally, this here is the the Australian model. Same sort of thing. Look what it does carefully. Brings it out, phase 8, phase 1, phase 2, or late January, then back in the neutral circle, then brings it back out again as we go into mid-February. Very significant development. Now, why is that important? This is what the MJO looks like in the month of January when you have a neutral conditions in phase 8. You can see blocking over Greenland. According to this, we have a negative NAO, and you have a nice ridge here on the west coast. You can see that. So as a result, the jet stream comes out of the north, and you get some sort of storm activity in the northeast, maybe the Mid-Atlantic, but I think mostly New England. And that's a fairly decent-looking storm pattern for January and the phase 8 on the MJO. If it goes into phase 1 in January, well, it also has strong blocking over Greenland and very stormy pattern for the whole much of the country. Big storms on the west coast, big storms on the east coast, pretty strong blocking pattern as well. So that's also fairly favorable in late January if that actually happens. Now, if we go into February phase 8, remember how these other models, let me call them up here so you can see it. See how the European was bringing it out to phase 8 in mid-February? If that happens, we get this. Now, this is the snowstorm map. When you're the MJO in phase 8, okay, in February, this is just a snowstorm pattern right here, folks. Huge blocking, monster trough in the Mid-Atlantic coast, if that happens. That's one of the reasons why I'm bullish about February. Might not be the case, and again, we still have to worry about this howling Pacific jet that might screw things up. But that's the way things are looking. So February looks very bullish for winter storms, but it's not a given. Remember, we're still dealing a long way out here. After we see the Midwest storm on January 25th, maybe we'll have a much better idea of how the first 10 days of February will develop. So let's get through first the Midwest storm, which might affect New England with a snowstorm on the 25th, and see what that looks like. This is meteorologist DT from weatherist.com. I'll talk to you soon.